I predict when society will collapse? I became interested in this question because I have seen so many warnings in pop culture about collapse. I just picked a few headlines to illustrate this. The Irish Times headline says, "Urgent research needed on risk of collapse of civilization due to climate crisis," say academics. The Express says, "Warning, society will collapse as era of cheap money ends in hyperinflation." A Live Science headline says, "Society is right on track for a global collapse. New study of infamous 1970s report finds." Phys.org says, "Natural systems in Australia are unraveling. If they collapse, human society could too." The Resilience website asks, "Will civilization collapse because it's running out of oil?" Changing America's headline says, "MIT predicted society would collapse by 2040. New data tells how we're doing." A Canadian Dimension article from Chris Hedges says, "We are not the first civilization to collapse, but we will probably be the last." And finally, the Bates student newspaper just has a headline that says, "Society is going to collapse." So you get the idea. These are just a small handful of the headlines, the articles, the YouTube videos I've seen, the news pieces about this coming supposed collapse of society. So I got interested in this from an actual academic perspective, not just the perspective of journalists trying to sell newspapers. Do academics actually know when a society is about to collapse? Can they warn about that? And would we know? Well, the short answer I found is no. Nobody can predict collapses. In fact, what I found is that even looking into the past, which is the easy part, right? The easy part of this equation is looking into the past and figuring out whether or not societies have collapsed in the past, then figuring out what caused them to collapse. Then we can try to apply all that information to modern society and predict a future collapse. But even looking into the past, researchers can't agree on whether societies in the past have collapsed or not, much less agree on a set of characteristics that they would say would predict a future collapse. So first, let's answer the question, what is a social collapse? Assuming that it does exist at all, again, some researchers don't believe in collapse at all, but assuming that it exists, what is a collapse? You can use Kemp's 2019 definition, which was an enduring loss of population, identity, and/or institutional complexity. So when you look at this one, we're talking about a society that used to have a large population, but now it has a very small population, or maybe no one is left from that society. You're also looking at the social identity disappearing and institutional complexity disappearing. Renfro gives another definition of collapse. Renfro says that collapse involves the loss of central administration, the disappearance of an elite, the decline in settlements, and a loss of social and political complexity. So here again, we're seeing this picture of a society that has lots of elites, lots of bureaucracy. It's probably an empire, and all of that sort of bureaucracy and elite status disappears. I found less formal definitions as well, as I found researchers just describing a collapse. I read that it may be experienced on the local, the national, or even the global scale. That this would be people who move from having an empire to only having a local state. That would be considered the collapse of an empire. It could also be when people move from one mode of subsistence to another. For example, if people were agriculturalists and then they moved to being pastoralists, then that could be considered a social collapse as well. I would say that the big threads that ran through all of these descriptions and definitions of collapse were about the loss of elites. When archaeologists are looking at a society and trying to decide whether or not it collapsed, most often they're going to be looking at features like there used to be a lot of palaces, and now nobody's building palaces anymore, so we're going to say this society collapsed. Or there used to be big government administrative buildings, and now no one's building those big administrative buildings anymore, so the society has collapsed. Archaeologists will also notice the loss of empire. Like this society used to be an empire and have tons of influence over its neighbors, but it has shrunk down. Its influence has shrunk and the empire is gone. So, when archaeologists and historians are talking about collapse, usually they're focused mostly on these centers of power that become a lot less powerful. The next major question to answer is what causes collapse? What I found was a cluster of three main ideas. There can be political or social turmoil in society. There can also be economic disruptions, and there might also be environmental disruptions. These are the three main causes of collapse. One thing I found is that social collapses are always multifaceted. Any one of these factors can fail, and that does not cause a social collapse. So, for example, the bubonic plague did not make either Europe or Asia collapse. As damaging as it was and as terrible as it was for the people who lived through it, their social and political structures and their economic structures stayed mostly intact. So, in spite of the fact that this was a hugely environmentally damaging event, a huge plague that wiped out a lot of the population, this is still not considered a social collapse by most researchers. Environmental events like floods or droughts can trigger disaster, but if the social and political structure and if the economic structure are strong enough, environmental disasters are not going to cause a social collapse all on their own. There have to be other players in these events to cause social collapse, such as political incompetence, corruption, civil war, insecurity, invasion, pandemics, protracted war, or the domination of one group by another. All of these can, in combination, cause social collapse, but any one of these isn't likely to cause collapse all by itself. Basically, societies collapse because they're unable to solve problems. Problems are always going to arise in every society, but the question is, can the society power through it? Can they solve it? Or do they collapse under the weight of that problem? One interesting analysis I found was that historians will always view collapses that they're studying back in history. They're going to view those historical records through the lens of their own society, their own society's fears or anxieties, or their own society's values and points of pride in their society. So, as long as there have been historians studying collapse, each of those historians has interpreted collapses through different lenses. For example, in 1377, a Muslim historian studied collapses starting with the collapse of the Roman Empire and on through and blamed greed and selfishness for the collapses. But that was mainly because he was critiquing his own society through this lens of historical collapse. In the mid 1800s, social Darwinists claimed that technology would keep social collapse at bay. So, of course, they were viewing historical collapses through the lens of their own positive outlook, their own optimism. The book, The Decline of the West, which was published around 1920 or so, said that collapse is caused by the demise of abstract thought, the empowerment of the rich, and the rise of authoritarianism. But of course, this author was viewing historical collapses through the lens of Europe at the time, with the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler, etc. Later, French authors focused on competing economic systems, long distance networking, warfare, pandemics, and they started to bring in environmental variability in their analysis of collapse. Modern collapse researchers tend to focus on environmental variables, even to the exclusion of other variables. Now, the reality is that collapses are always caused by multiple variables, not just one. But because climate change is something that we in the modern world are very scared of, justifiably so, then we, again, are tending to view past collapses through that lens almost exclusively. So, one last question to answer as we talk about what causes collapses, and that's the question, do collapses happen on a predictable cycle? I've seen a few news pieces saying things like, social collapses happen every 80 years and we're due for one. No, there's no research evidence that that is true. In fact, I found researchers saying the opposite, that any society can collapse. There is no predictable cycle about it. There's no kind of like lifespan for societies. Societies can collapse when they're very young. Other societies can exist for a very long time and then collapse, and there is no predictable cycle to it. So whenever you see people saying society's due for a collapse, that's fake news. You shouldn't believe it. Also, when you see news that says that society is due for a collapse because of, and then they'll name one factor, one politician, one political group, or political movement. One factor, like a certain kind of technology, society's going to collapse because of cell phones, or society's going to collapse because we're running out of oil, or just one environmental problem. Society's going to collapse because of rising sea levels. I wouldn't believe it. All the social collapses that have happened in history have been because of multiple factors, all combining. Collapse is too slow to notice while it's happening. Now, this really surprised me. I figured that social collapses would be really fast events, that society would be ticking along just fine, and then a year later, everything has collapsed. But it just doesn't work that way. Let me give you some examples. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, from what I can tell, collapsed over a period of 300 years. Now, that is very widely seen as a kind of prototypical example of a social collapse, and yet that took 300 years. The New Kingdom of Egypt took 123 years from start to finish of the collapse. So most researchers would label that one as a quick collapse. Keep that in mind. 123 years is a quick collapse when we're talking about collapses. The Maya, which is one of the most well-recognized of societies that has collapsed, took about 1,000 years from what most researchers claim was the beginning of the collapse to the end of the collapse. Some sites started to be abandoned around 700 CE, but the last Mayan site was actually abandoned around 1700 CE. So that's 1,000 years of slow collapse. The Mesopotamian region has been labeled as a collapse site, and it is generally recognized to have collapsed over a period of 700 years in two kind of waves of collapse, one following the other. The fall of Rome is really seen as the prototypical collapse. When you're talking about the collapse of civilizations, most Average people and researchers are going to think of the fall of Rome. And it is true that in 1410 the Visigoths sacked Rome. But what a lot of people don't pay attention to is that researchers say that the fall of Rome actually took centuries, and the sacking of Rome was just one event in the middle of the fall of Rome. So even though some people might try to claim that Rome fell in this one discrete event, the sacking of Rome, the reality is that the fall of Rome took centuries. Even if one quick event starts a cascade effect that ends in collapse, researchers say that usually collapse is never going to be any quicker than 100 years. So when researchers say that collapse can be very quick, they're referring to collapse over 100 years. When they say that collapse is most often slow, they're referring to collapses that take 500 years, 700 years, 1,000 years. If you were living through the collapse of one of these civilizations, you probably wouldn't notice. You wouldn't think of it as a collapse. And there wouldn't be any day that you walked outside and said, boy, my society sure is collapsing. It just doesn't actually work that way. So when you're thinking about the collapse of societies, take the image out of your mind that's been planted there from so many books and movies and TV shows of people running, screaming through the streets and trying to escape hordes of other people or monsters or whatever it is that you've seen in media. Take that image out of your mind. We're talking about a society slowly fading in its prominence, in its power. But if you're in that society, you probably wouldn't even notice it. So is social collapse even real? That was one of the questions I had after reading these descriptions of collapse. I mean, the image that I had in my mind of movies, books, and TV shows that show climate disasters, zombie apocalypses, and civil wars just doesn't seem to be true. That isn't how societies fade away, is with some big bang, with some big battle or event where nothing is the same again. Instead, societies just kind of fade slowly. Now, there is no doubt that there have been many times in history where elites had power and then they lost it. And if you define collapse that way, then yeah, collapses are completely real. But these collapses happen so slowly over time that the media image of collapse, no, that really isn't real. That doesn't exist. In most of the social collapses that historians and archaeologists study, it seems like most people went on with business as usual, with the occasional crisis just like today. In the past 20 years, we've lived through multiple crises. We've lived through, of course, COVID. We've lived through January 6th. We've lived through the housing bubble crisis that ended up hurting the global economy. We've lived through multiple crises, but our society is still intact. And in the same way, if you actually were living in a collapsing society, there would be small crises all along the way, but you wouldn't recognize those as meaning that the society was going to collapse, because all societies, whether they're collapsing or not, have these crises. For example, let's talk about the collapse of Rome. As Rome lost power, some villages in England clung to Roman culture, while others quickly abandoned the Latin language, Roman-style kitchenware, and Roman architecture. So depending on where you were, you might see more or less Roman influence, even after the period of time that historians claim Rome had already collapsed. And in fact, researchers found that after Rome collapsed, the health of the people living within the Roman Empire actually improved. When they study skeletons from that period of time, it seems like a lot of people's lives actually improved once Rome was gone. We can see a similar pattern in the collapse of the old Egyptian kingdom. The concept of a king went from one king who was ruling over all of Egypt to instead, the kingdom got splintered into multiple pieces and there were multiple small regional kings. But life basically continued as it had been going anyway. The average peasant in Egypt probably didn't even know that the collapse had happened. And most of them probably didn't even notice that they had a much smaller region that their king was ruling over versus in the past. Copper continued to be imported, and the lives of everyday people just didn't change that much. The reason why researchers say that the old kingdom of Egypt collapsed was because there was a dramatic redistribution of power from the top down. But if you were on the lower rungs of society, it probably didn't affect your life any. Let's look at the collapse of the Mayan Empire as another example. Researchers call this a collapse because huge cities were abandoned, monumental architecture stopped being built, royal inscriptions were halted. So here again, you can see that these elites, these huge buildings, these palaces, the buildings that enabled the bureaucracy of the Mayan Empire stopped being built. And when researchers call this a collapse, they can point to different factors that caused this change. They blame it on foreign invasion, epidemics, social revolt, and the collapse of trade. But researcher Elizabeth Graham can't find any discontinuity in her Maya archaeology digs. She's out there in the field digging up Mayan archaeology, and she says she can't find any evidence in the area she's digging of collapse. There's no sign of crisis during the supposed collapse. Skeletons show no increased dietary stress. She can't find any evidence of population declines. Terraces and dams are maintained, and sophisticated pottery continued to be crafted. So, where's the collapse? Now, in contrast, another researcher, Stephen Houston, digs another region of Mayan archaeology, and he does find evidence of collapse in the area that he's digging. He does emphasize, though, that it wasn't like people were just dying in the street during the period of time that he would call collapse. Instead, it was more like people just voted with their feet and moved. So even the area that he's seeing where he would say there was a collapse, it wasn't like a crisis, a battle, a war. People weren't dying. Instead, it was more like a whole bunch of people just moved away because the Mayan Empire wasn't working for them anymore. So this shows that the Mayan collapse really did exist in some locations, although of course it didn't look the way that movies and TV shows would prime us to think that collapse would. But it did exist in some areas, but it just doesn't exist in other areas of the Mayan Empire. The collapse is uneven. So calling the Mayan Empire's collapse a collapse might be a little bit misleading, simply because our popular imagination of what a collapse is just really doesn't apply. Some researchers actually criticize this. They say that there's an industry of apocalypse in religion, Hollywood, and academia, that it's a popular narrative in our society that claims that collapse happens, but really it's ignoring how resilient societies actually are. The old way of life might be quietly revamped, but it's kind of misleading to call that a collapse. That's not at all to downplay the danger of climate change. Climate change is a very real danger on Earth, and it really is very serious for all of us. But it does highlight the way that human societies have dealt with change in the past. Human societies generally don't deal with these major changes with the images that we see in modern media. Collapse may be a good thing. I found some researchers who made this claim that social collapse may actually be a good thing, and collapse is not at all the word that we should be using for it because collapse conjures up such negative images. For example, The Dawn of Everything is a book that describes how societies can move fluidly between having more structure or less structure, having elites or having no elites, having lots of cultural influence over their neighbors and essentially being empires, to not being empires. And this book emphasizes the fluidity of human society. Researchers are most likely to label a society as collapsed when they see a loss of elites, loss of palaces, loss of huge buildings, loss of evidence that one person is dominating another person, or the loss of empire. But Dawn of Everything asks, is it really a bad thing for elites to stop dominating everyone below them, or for a society to stop being an empire dominating all their neighbors? The collapse of kings and elites and empire status may be actually signaling the end of inequality and ushering in a new era of possibly peace and living in harmony with each other and respecting each other, respecting human rights. You got a hint of this earlier when I mentioned that the collapse of the Roman Empire actually made peasants' lives better. There's evidence that people were actually healthier after the Roman Empire left. Now, that's just one example, but there could be many examples like this where the collapse of an empire is actually really good for the people in that empire who might have been mistreated, who might have been lower caste, who might have even been slaves. History is written by the winners, but history is also written by the rich and the powerful. We can read historical accounts of these kinds of collapses and see that rich and powerful people might have mourned the loss of power and status and wealth. But we should realize that that writing is from only one perspective, and in a lot of cases, it's just flat out propaganda. We don't have to accept the propaganda of rich elites in the past and assume that whenever they lost power, society was crumbling without them. The reality is, collapse might be a great thing. Now, that's not to say that it always is. It is definitely possible that the collapse of an empire or the collapse of elites would also be accompanied by a lot of really negative things like climate crises, like natural disasters or civil wars, in which case then, yeah, everyday people's lives are going to be much worse during this collapse. But that isn't always the case with all of the world historical events that we call social collapses. Some of them seem to have actually made the everyday person's life much better. In The Dawn of Everything, the authors point out how our definition of collapse being tied to the loss of elites, the loss of empire, really says a lot more about us and our perspectives than it does about the people who lived through those collapses. It says that we're enamored with power and we're enamored with empire to the point that it's hard for us to imagine that civilization exists without those things. When people moved from societies that were very hierarchical with a lot of elites who were very wealthy and powerful and got to tell everyone else what to do, and then maybe there's like a peasant rebellion and all the regular people overthrow those elites and then create a society that's more equal. Our historians, modern historians, are going to look at that and say, oh, that society collapsed. So it says a lot about us that we interpret the most unequal societies as the societies at the height of their power. And then we interpret more equal societies as collapsed. Let's summarize what we've talked about here. There are lots of modern predictions of social collapse, and most, if not all, are fake news. Collapse, as it's defined by researchers, involves social and political crisis, economic crisis, and environmental crises, and all of these usually come together, multiple crises come together to make a society collapse. Any one of these is not enough to make a society collapse. The concept of social collapse usually focuses on elites and empires. A true social collapse will be way, way too slow to notice it's happening while it's happening. This isn't something that happens overnight in a period of a few weeks or even a few years. A quick social collapse only takes a century. So think about that. We could be living through a social collapse right now, and we're probably not going to notice. In that sense, social collapses may not be real. If you're thinking about social collapses as they're portrayed in pop culture, that image is not real. If you're thinking about social collapses as they extend over 400 or 500 years, then yes, that does happen. But the image from pop culture, no, that really isn't something that happens. And finally, social collapses aren't always a good thing, but they may be a good thing, depending on your view of society. If you're a person who wants more equality in society, then social collapses, the collapse of the elite and the collapse of empire, might be a great thing.